The Comics Alternative is a member of the Queen City Podcast Network. For more information, go to queencitypodcastnetwork.com.
This is the Comics Alternative, on location at Heroes Aren't Hard to Find. Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Comics Alternative, on location. I'm Derek.
And I'm Mike. We are two guys with PhDs talking about comics.
That's right. And it being an on-location show, you know that we're back at Heroes Aren't Hard to Find. They're located at 417 Pecan Avenue in Charlotte, North Carolina. If you're in the area, or, you know, if you live here, if you're visiting, it's even worth going out of your way. Come to Heroes Aren't Hard to Find, the best comic shop in the Carolinas. You can't go wrong. They have a great selection and even better, wonderful people who work here. That's Heroes Aren't Hard to Find. And we thank them for allowing us to come into their shop every month, or now bi-monthly, and take up space in their store and do this.
And talk about comics.
That's right, and that's what we're going to do. We should also mention that the Comics Alternative on Location series is now part of the Queen City Podcast Network. So check them out, Queen City Podcast Network. I think we're the 8th show now to be a part of them, so they are growing quickly, especially given the fact that this network started just last spring.
True. And if they survive us, you know, anything is possible.
That's right. That's right. So Queen City Podcast Network, we're proud to be a part of that. And, you know, Mike, one of the things that you and I have been doing since we, I guess a few months ago, started to co-host the on-location shows is to go over, you with mainstream titles, me with alternative or indie.
Right, yeah.
Yeah, and okay, so what about the mainstream has excited you over the past few weeks since we last talked?
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm a little bit behind in my reading. I'm trying to keep up with a whole number of titles, and I fall behind. So this week I thought I would focus on a couple of titles featuring more or less second-tier characters, but as I came into the shop and was chatting with the folks here tonight, I realized there was also another big event, another big publication in comics, and I will get to that in just a moment, but let me warn all of our listeners that when we get to that part of the conversation, it's going to be an R-rated conversation. So if you have small children nearby at this moment, you may want to usher them out of the room till we get to that. And with that as a terrible, terrible introduction, let me talk about some of those titles featuring long-running kind of second-tier characters. And I want to focus on Marvel's most recent iteration of Doctor Strange, written by Mark Waid and drawn by Jesus Saiz. Please forgive my horrible pronunciation. And DC's Hawkman, their new series of Hawkman, written by Robert Venditti and drawn by Brian Hitch. Neither Doctor Strange nor Hawkman have ever set the world on fire with their sales. Doctor Strange has probably had a little bit more of a reliable history. And, of course, it's always worth focusing on a Steve Ditko character, still just a month or so after Ditko's death. What's interesting about Doctor Strange, particularly in this version written by Mark Waid, is the transposition of the character to a science fiction setting. It's interesting to take characters with long histories like this and see how the formulas get changed and revived. It's also probably worth noting that Mark Waid himself is somebody who's been in the industry for a long time, a consistently solid writer in terms of characterization and plot, integrating threads from the characters' long histories. And he really does all of that beautifully here. It's also a lot of fun seeing Doctor Strange in space with the kind of bubble helmet that Wally Wood's science fiction comics for EC in the 1950s used to feature. The basic gist of this is that for some reason Doctor Strange has lost touch with magic on Earth and is going through outer space to find magical artifacts to help him revive that. They're fun and interesting stories that bring in old characters like the Super Skrull. They also weave in elements from the last run on Doctor Strange, written by a very new writer, at least new to me, a guy named Donny Cates, who introduced Bats the Ghost Dog, a very interesting addition to Doctor Strange's cast. They're fun and interesting stories, and they show the kind of work that can be done in a really solid way in mainstream comics. And I look forward to seeing this as it goes on. Doctor Strange here, as he has been more or less consistently presented in a lot of Marvel's comics, is a bit of a manipulative character. And that's an interesting twist on his personality. He is, as always, a bit of a ladies' man as well. Another interesting twist on Doctor Strange's personality. Maybe it's the mustache, who knows? But it's a fun and enjoyable run on the series. And then there's Hawkman. Hawkman is a character with a long lineage going far back before Doctor Strange, back to the 1940s, created by Gardner Fox, and I'm going to struggle to remember who did the original art on Hawkman back in the 1940s. If you can find a copy of Jules Feiffer's The Great Comic Book Heroes, one of the first great books on the history of comics, Pfeiffer has a long discussion of how that original artist, Sheldon Moldoff, maybe? I think that's probably not right. Used swipes from Flash Gordon and other comic strips in there, and they are exotic, almost Indiana Jones kind of adventures. Of course, over the many decades of his history, sometimes managing to hold on to his title, sometimes not. Hawkman was revived as a science fiction character in the 1960s, again by Gardner Fox, working first with Joe Kubert, and whose name I've also mangled, and Murphy Anderson. That seems to be my trend tonight. With many, many iterations of the character, probably the most successful recent one was done maybe 5 to 7 years ago by Jeff Johns and an array of different artists that essentially revived the 1940s version of the character as a sort of reincarnated Egyptian prince. What's interesting in the new series is the way Robert Venditti and Brian Hitch are trying to weave together all those elements of the convoluted continuity, and doing a fun and interesting job. I think one of the things that interests me about the series also is to see Brian Hitch at this stage of his career. Hitch, of course, was a superstar artist, particularly, a decade or so ago, working with Mark Millar on the Ultimates for Marvel and really reviving those characters and paving the way for the versions of Marvel's Avengers that we see in the movies. And it's interesting to see Hitch now working on what is surely a kind of second-tier title. One can see a little less detail in his work than the kind of incredibly intricate detail that he brought to the Ultimates, and before that, The Authority, working with Warren Ellis. But it's still fun and occasionally beautiful work. Hawkman is traveling through space and time, meeting various other versions of his own character, weaving in the Hawkman character who was reintroduced by Tim Truman ages ago in a miniseries called Hawk World. So interesting to see both of these long-established characters, Doctor Strange and Hawkman, still soldiering on in interesting new manifestations of those titles. But if we want to go to the big headline for this week that I didn't realize was going to be the big headline, and parents, here's the time to take your kids out of the room. It would be the publication last week of the first in DC's new Black Label line, which was Batman Damned by Brian Azzarello and Lee Bermejo. Again, another name I can mangle in tonight's episode. The format of the Black Label titles is interesting. It reminds me of the way Frank Miller introduced a new format with The Dark Knight Returns way back in 1986. It is a magazine-sized publication on slick paper that reproduces very well the art for that. And it's kind of a Vertigo take on Batman, in which the Joker appears to have been murdered. We'll see how long that lasts. Batman has no memory of these events. We meet him first in having been badly wounded in some kind of encounter. We've got Vertigo characters in there as well, including John Constantine in a primary role and a little bit of Deadman. Maybe Zatanna too. So, again, we've got kind of a Vertigo take on this. But, okay, here's where the R-rated stuff begins.
Okay, kids.
What apparently has sent the title soaring in its price, as I heard tonight from Shelton Drum, the owner of Heroes Aren't Hard to Find, that the title, which retails for about $7.95, is now selling on eBay for anywhere from $50 to $100. What makes this title so interesting and so exciting?
And expensive.
So hard to find. No pun intended. It is nude scenes featuring Batman. So for the first time in the history of Batman, going back to, 1939, we get to see Batman's penis. I'm not sure how significant this will be in comics history, but I was amused by the various forms of nomenclature attached to this issue now, referring to this issue as Batawang, referring to Batman in this issue as his boy Wonder, and also in this issue, we're losing it now, as the first appearance of Little Batman. So if you're interested in a unique collector's item and are willing to pay vast sums of money for what is actually really a pretty good story, and great art, it looks like a really interesting premise to the series, which is getting notice for all the wrong reasons, you might want to seek this out. As I think about kind of the historical ironies of this, I am reminded of at least an apocryphal tale about the 1965 television series with Adam West and Burt Ward, a very important event for me as a small child. Apparently, Adam West and Burt Ward had to take certain medicines to deflate their anatomy so that it would not show under those great costumes. And I think it's ironic that however many decades later, now, the appearance of Batman's penis has created a new collector's item. So, I'm happy to, I've always said in bringing up the mainstream and comics alternative, which, was a program with much greater ambitions before I joined its cast. And I thought, I was doing a bad thing by just talking about superhero titles, but I'm happy now to bring us to new lows as well. With a discussion of Batman's penis in this episode. So thank you all for listening.
Yeah. Okay, what you just said, two things immediately come to mind. First and foremost is as you were going through various, I guess, subtitles for this particular issue.
Correct, yeah.
Like Little Batman and whatnot. I felt all of a sudden that maybe I should slip into an Ed McMahon-ish kind of role where you would make a joke and I would go, ha ha, yes. The other thing that came
These
to
are
mind,
career highlights for both of us, I believe.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Now, the other thing that I thought about is, believe it or not, this is actually not the first time that Batman's crotch was discussed on the Comics Alternative.
Wow.
2 years, yeah.
Damn, I'm disappointed now.
2 years ago, we had Evan Dorkin on the show, who I don't know if you've ever seen Evan talk at a con or anything.
No.
He is all over the place. He
right.
is, I have to really keep up with him. And at one point, he made a reference to Batman, and he said something about Batman's junk. And then he paused for a beat and said, "Oh, I don't mean his penis, but I mean the things that he has on his belt."
Right.
That only could have come from Evan. And so that was, I guess, the first reference on the podcast to Batman's private parts. But here you go into more detail.
Yeah, I think what we're doing now is identifying a subtext in superhero comics that have been around for quite some time. And the only connection, one connection I can make right now is remembering many years ago, the New Yorker review of the first Hulk film with Eric Bana, directed by Ang Lee, an interesting, albeit flawed film that described basically the plot of the Hulk as revolving around tumescence and detumescence. So, once again, I think we've hit some real highlights tonight on this episode. We should probably wrap it up right now and go out on a high note, but that would be unfair too.
Good night, folks. We'll be back later. Yeah. Okay, so now is this the first title within their Black Line DCs?
Yeah, they're bringing out a new, as I understand it, a new line, and now we can enter into the whole tangled question of continuity, featuring major characters in stories outside of continuity. And the only one that I can think of right now that I know is coming, something I'm very interested in seeing, is Frank Miller, I think maybe working with John Romita Jr. on Superman Year One. Frank Miller is all over the block these days in terms of his writing and his production. But to get serious for a moment, marginally so, given the importance of Frank Miller and David Mazzucchelli's Batman Year One, which is arguably the best Batman story ever, and we can have a great argument about that, I think his take on Superman Year One is going to be interesting, and one hopes perhaps that he restrains some of the satirical excesses of his recent work. I don't know what else is coming out in this line, but it does seem interesting.
I wonder if the other or future titles from that line will be as risque and as controversial as this one has appeared to be. And in fact, when I first came into the shop tonight, albeit a couple of minutes late because of frickin' traffic in Charlotte, you and Shelton were talking about, as you mentioned earlier, the pricing on eBay of that and how that has influenced the pricing that some retailers, how some shops are selling the title for now. And I had talked with, I think it was day before yesterday, the new co-host of the weekly review show, Sturgios Batzakis, and he had mentioned that his local shop, as much as he liked it, he regretted that the owner marked up significantly the cost of that single issue.
Wow. Yeah.
Because of eBay.
Yeah, and that gets us kind of into the disconcerting area of speculation in comics, which I guess will go on as long as we're talking about a medium that is collectible.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's interesting in that on the one hand, I try my best not to think in terms of, like with buying comics, individual single issues primarily, collectability in mind. On the other hand, I do think of that, especially with certain issues that I think may have low print runs that may, that I will discover accidentally by buying a first issue, let's say. Sometimes I think in those terms, sometimes I don't. That's probably one of the reasons why I tend to buy a lot of #1 issues from Image, is because in the past, not lately, but in the past, several of their titles, the very first or second issue, is underprinted to where it becomes more of a rarity. It becomes a little more pricey. Like Chew was a good example. I bought the first issue of Chew, second, third, fourth issue of Chew, without realizing that within a year that the price on that or on those issues would go up significantly for the collector's market.
And do you then actually go out and sell these?
No, I haven't.
Issues? Okay.
No. And in fact, the first few issues of Chew are some of the few comics that I have had slabbed. Right. I really don't slab much. The first couple of issues of Rachel Rising I've had slabbed just because those are also a little on the rare side. So, but yeah, I try not to think with a collector's mind, but every now and again I slip into that.
Sure. And the idea of slabbing a comic is ultimately that at some point down the road you might resell it and it will be in absolutely pristine condition that way.
Yeah.
Got it.
Whether I do or not's another matter, but there is that thought going on in my head. So, okay. So I didn't even check. Do they have that issue of Batman here at the shop?
They do not. As I understand it, it is complete. Oh, there is a copy right there.
Oh, we have a customer who just showed us his copy.
Yeah. It must have been in his reserve bag because I don't see it on the shelf now. and it is apparently very hard to find, as much as I can see the shelf from here.
Oh, okay. Well, I hope you enjoy Batman's Junk.
It's great junk.
I think we have a subtitle for the show. Great Junk. Okay. You were also earlier talking about Mark Waid. And,
right,
I have to say, even though I've read some of his Marvel stuff, I haven't read a lot.
Yeah.
But he is an impressive writer in the other, let's say, non-superhero stuff that he's done that I've just been really impressed by. And I think...
What titles are you thinking of?
Well, I like what he does with his own webcomic site, Thrillbent. But I also appreciate his work with Archie.
Okay.
And what he did with the Archie property, in that let me see, it was him and not Veronica.
I want to say Fiona Staples.
Fiona Staples, yeah.
Saga,
And then after Fiona Staples, it was Veronica Fish. He and Staples took Archie and made it contemporary without losing some of the original tone, innocence and otherwise, in Archie, which is different from what the creators behind the various horror titles like Afterlife with Archie, Vampironica, and then Jughead, The Hunger.
Right.
They've, I guess, taken Archie properties and made them a little more mature, especially in terms of the violence. But with the revamped Waid Archie, it was fine. I think it's something that young kids could read as well as adults. And to put Archie in a more contemporary context, I appreciated that. I really liked what he did.
Yeah, sounds interesting. At some point down the road, I'll have to check that out. As always, I am behind on all titles.
And Archie's not one of those comics that I would on my own seek out. It's only when they do new things, which over the past several years has been fairly frequent, that they're doing something. So, for instance, there's the new Archie 1941 title.
Right, which I did pick up but have not gotten to yet. This is also an example, again, of how you can tell there's a concerted strategy here, because the character has been revived, the titles have been revived, many of them now done in new forms in which they're tying in elements of the horror genre. And, of course, all of that is coinciding with the appearance on television of the show Riverdale. So, again, you can see that at least probably at the corporate level, there's a concerted strategy to revive these characters and do that, what would one say, across multiple different platforms?
Now, have you seen an episode or more of Riverdale?
I have not. That, of course, that as a someone with a PhD, that does not stop me from talking about it, however.
Well, the reason I ask is I've seen, I think the very first episode, not when it originally aired. I think I saw it on Netflix.
Sure.
I think late last year. My daughter has watched a few episodes, and I was asking her last year, it's like, oh, have you watched Riverdale? And she said, yeah. I said, well, what do you think about it? And she said, well, it's okay, but it strikes me as something that I and my generation or even younger would probably enjoy more than you would. So I was intrigued. And it is on CW. And there are a lot of CW shows that do have a particular feel to them.
Sure.
Right?
Yeah.
And so I did watch that first episode of Riverdale, and I did get a CW vibe. And it is, as some people have described it, kind of a mixture between the Archie that we grew up with and Twin Peaks, because there is a darker side to things. So, I appreciated that. It's just that first episode didn't nudge me enough to want to watch anything beyond that.
Yeah.
Maybe someday.
Sure. So what are you reading this week, Derek?
Well, I've been reading a lot of things with, the podcast and the various series that we have. But the things that I wanted to discuss on today's show, our On Location show, are comics that we haven't been and probably won't discuss on our regular review show. But Mike, before I get into the titles that I'm interested in discussing for this episode, I do want to mention another show that is a part of the Queen City Podcast Network, and this is American Timelines. So go to your favorite podcatcher, whether it be Apple Podcast or any like Overcast or I don't know, whatever podcaster you use, and do a search for American Timelines, and you'll find it. And you'll find that it is a very interesting show. So basically you have Amy and Joe. They enjoy reminiscing about pop culture and talking about crazy things that have happened with them, especially within the context of pop culture. Now, Amy loves murder and Joe loves old school wrestling. An interesting combination, but they both love podcasts.
Not as different as one might think.
Well, yeah, it's a good point. But they both love podcasts, and so they try to merge all of their interests year by year by discussing pop culture. So there's the timeline part of the title, American Timelines. So this season, they're reliving the 1970s. So if you're a fan of pop culture, if you're a fan of murder and old school wrestling, and especially of the 1970s, then now would be the time to jump on board American Timelines. Search for it on your favorite podcatcher, and it's also a part of the Queen City Podcast Network, which we are now.
We are indeed.
Yes. Okay, so getting to your earlier question about the things that I've been reading recently that I wanted to discuss on the show, there are two series that have recently started from recognizable publishers. And then I also want to talk about a self-published creator that I became familiar with just last week when I was attending Small Press Expo. Now, the first title I want to discuss is actually something that I thought that maybe we would discuss on a regular review show of the Comics Alternative, but it just kind of fell through the cracks, unfortunately. But this is Black Badge. This is from the creative team that brought us Grass Kings, Matt Kindt, and Tyler Jenkins. And this comes out, or has come out, from Boom Studio. Now, the first issue was released, I think, very early this month. Issue number 2, which I have a review copy of, an advanced reader's copy, doesn't come out until next Wednesday as we record this, October 3rd. So if I mention anything about issue number 2 as listeners are hearing this the last week of September, then you haven't gotten your issue of Black Badge yet, but it'll be out next week. Now, have you read any Black Badge, like the first issue?
No.
Okay. Are you a fan of Matt Kindt?
A little bit.
Like Man Management?
Yeah,
Grass
can't say I've been
Kings.
able to follow his career all that much.
Yeah. Department H. Yeah, and you know, I really enjoyed Grass Kings that he and Jenkins did. And so they team up now again for this new series, which is only going to be 9 issues. And the premise is that there is a special merit badge that not many people know about called the Black Badge. And in order to earn the Black Badge, you have to be, I guess, selected and be a part of a select team of scouts that, I guess, with the government, I mean, I've read the first 2 issues and I think it's government related, but it's still not entirely clear from what I can recall, go on special assignments. And so in the first issue of Black Badge, the Boy Scouts or the scouts that are involved with the Black Badge, and their names are Kenny, Cliff, Mitz, and Willie. They're in Seoul, Korea. And they get lost on a canoeing outing and end up in North Korean territory. But while they're there,
But everything is fine now with North Korea, the president has told us.
Exactly. So, he's not Little Rocket Man anymore. He is someone to be respected. So, but anyway, while the scouts are in North Korea, they do some reconnaissance, and several things go on. And so it's a little interesting. In many ways, it kind of aligns with what Matt Kindt has done in many of his other titles, where you have this kind of off the books, or if you will, alternative kind of elite team that is tasked with investigating or seeking out secret information in ways that more official, regular, above-the-board organizations don't or cannot. And so that's what the Black Badge is all about. Now, the second issue that's going to be coming out next week takes place in Siberia. And so the 4 scouts go, in fact, even
Again, part of a country where everything is just going swell.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Two Trump-related countries in many ways. The 4 scouts who are part of the Black Badge team, go immediately from Korea to Seoul or to Siberia. And they even mention in the opening pages of issue number 2, it's like, wow, they didn't give us any rest. We just went from one assignment to the other. And in the second issue, I want to say team up, but it's maybe a qualified team up with a Canadian group of scouts who have a similar task that is kind of specialized undercover select. And so they, have their reconnaissance and whatnot. So that I like. The first 2 issues of Black Badge, it doesn't strike me as heavy as the earlier Kent Jenkins title, Grass Kings, and definitely not as thick or substantial as Mind Management or Department H. This seems more, how do I put this? Maybe, and I don't mean this in a bad way, superficial. It's fun. And at least with the first 2 issues, it seems that what we may have across the 9 issues that this series is projected to be, we may have different adventures with each issue where with every one you have these scouts play a part in whatever task that they have, and the result doesn't necessarily link to what happens in the next issue or the previous issue, let's say.
Right.
So, and it seems fun. And in my book, you can't go wrong with Matt Kindt. I really enjoy Tyler Jenkins as an artist. And so, yeah, that's something that I would definitely recommend. So issue number 2 again comes out next week. Now, another title that I wanted to discuss was actually released today as we're recording this on the 26th of September. And this is Man-Eaters #1, which came out from Image Comics. And this is written by Chelsea Cain with art by Kate Niemczyk. I guess that's how you pronounce her last name. Niemczyk.
There's actually no precedent on this podcast for actually pronouncing names correctly.
Yeah.
So I just try to lower the standards for that just to make it easier for everyone.
Now, I was looking forward to this for a number of reasons. Having read the first issue, I'm not exactly sure what to think. Now, I've said on the podcast, the regular review show, a number of times, and I remember mentioning this at our last On Location show, but whenever there's a #1 issue of a new series, whether it be ongoing or a mini or limited series, there's certain criteria that I always look for, and I like to phrase it in terms of questions. Are enough questions answered in that first issue that gives me enough of a grasp in order to understand what's going on in this first issue, but still questions remaining that will propel me or to get me to want to pick up issues number 2, 3, so on and so forth. With that first part, are there enough questions answered to have me wrap my brain around what's going on in the first issue? I'm not sure I can answer that in the affirmative with Man-Eaters. The story is about, okay, first off, it's narrated by a young girl whose father is a detective. And first half, for the most part, of this first issue of Man-Eaters is devoted to the young narrator telling us about very little about who she is, but I think much more about her father and her relationship with her father and him being a detective and what that means. Then when we get about halfway through the first issue is what we get to what I assume is going to be the premise of this series, and that is there is something going on with the female population that certain young women turn into felines. Literally, they turn into cats, big cats,
sure, yeah.
That kill. And so there's a special division of the police force devoted to this phenomena, and it's called, interestingly enough, SCAT, the Strategic Cat Apprehension Team. And one of the things that struck me about this first issue is that we're about halfway through this initial issue before we're introduced to the feline female phenomena. And I would have thought that if this is the series premise, this would have been mentioned a little earlier instead of spending so much time with the narrator's father being a detective and all that. Also, I'm not entirely sure what is going on with young women turning into cats and why that's significant. I mean, I can see it and I can speculate, I can project, but I don't think that it's necessarily my role as a reader of a first issue in a new series to try to fill in the gaps. I think that most gaps should, not all, but most gaps should be filled in by the writer and artist. I don't know if I would call this a successful first issue, or another way of putting that is I'm really not sure if I'm going to go on to read issues 1 or 2 and 3 of Man-Eaters after the first issue. Maybe if I go back and reread issue number 1, I'll feel a little better about it. But I feel, I don't know, rather mixed about this first issue of Man-Eaters.
You know, and I think this raises again a question we've touched on in previous episodes. The difficulty, particularly given the way all comics now revolve around serialized narratives, the difficulty of an opening chapter that is a satisfying read in itself, as well as one that works effectively to set up a long-running storyline. You know, as you're describing this to me, a couple of things come to mind. First of all, we've got a comic by 2 female creators, and I think that's important. I've been a little bit conscious, as I've thought about what I was going to talk about today, of focusing on only male characters and only male creators, and I think that's an oversight. If I'm recalling correctly, Chelsea Cain wrote Marvel's Mockingbird series for a while. Again, I'm a PhD. I haven't read this, but it doesn't stop me from talking about it. But I remember there was controversy of a particular issue which featured the character on the cover with a T-shirt saying, "Yes, I'm a feminist." In what is still largely, predominantly, but less so all the time, male world of comic books involving both the audience and the creators, there was surprisingly a backlash to that particular issue and that particular take on the character. So I can't help but wonder if a series entitled Man-Eaters about women who turn into great cats and
attack
and eat
humans,
men,
yeah,
is going to explore some of those gender issues, and that strikes me as potentially an interesting premise for a series. Of course, you know how you unfold that premise and lead people into that world and lead people into that narrative is those things are all huge considerations. But it sounds like it at least has the potential to be a timely series. We're talking about this today, the evening before the massive congressional hearings on the Brett Kavanaugh case and the accusations against him. We're, in the thick of the Me Too movement now, and we're rethinking all kinds of gender roles, and we're rethinking all kinds of issues about male behavior, perhaps one shouldn't say assuming, if the stories about Brett Kavanaugh's behavior are true. We'll find out more as we go along, but certainly that seems reminiscent of a kind of toxic masculinity in our culture. And the premise of this comic sounds like it might have some interesting things to say in that particular context of this particular cultural and political moment. So I might go out and find this series and take a look at it myself and pick it up. It sounds like, however difficult the beginning of that narrative is, there's some interesting things to look for in it.
Yeah. Now, what you were mentioning, and I did want to talk to you about the whole Mockingbird phenomena, right? Especially since that was a Marvel comic.
Sure.
What you were just mentioning in terms of any kind of feminist message that could be taken from Man-Eaters, at least according to this first issue, I'm all for that. And in fact, I think that that's one of this series' potential strengths. My problem, though, is with this initial first issue and the way that the story is introduced.
Right.
It just seems a little wobbly.
Sure.
And I hope that with the second and then the third issues, it's a little more sturdy in terms of letting me know what the series is going to be about.
Right. Yeah, you can't get away from those basic narrative issues.
Yeah, exactly. And but thematically, it does seem really intriguing. Mm-hmm. And I'm with you. I was wondering as I was reading this first issue of Man-Eaters if perhaps the story is, I guess, a reaction to what Cain experienced in her handling of Mockingbird. I remember this was about, was it 3 years ago, 2 years ago, something like that?
About 3 or 4 years.
Okay, so maybe longer than 3 years, where she had this title. And
Time flies in this era.
Yeah, and then she, I guess, relatively abruptly left it, and she was even, in many ways, kind of hounded off of Twitter just because of all the fanboys who gave her a hard time about that. Yeah. I mean, that's just one additional example of why I weep for my gender, which I tend to do more and more frequently, it seems. Yeah. But, I mean, that's unfortunate. So I'm just curious if, in some ways, Man-Eaters may be a reaction to her experiences with Mockingbird. Now, you say you weren't reading Mockingbird that she had written?
Yeah, no, I've just read about all of these issues, at a remove, just monitoring comics journalism, what was happening there. At some point, of course, I'd love to go back and take a look at them and try to assess them. I think that raises all kinds of interesting questions about the comics world, the audience, the creators, the role of gender in that. And certainly one of the things that I've seen trying to just stay informed about what's happening in the world of comics is that indeed the demographics of the comics audience has changed significantly over the last 5 to 10 years, and continues to change. And all of that's really exciting and really, really healthy for the industry. This can lead us into the thickets of all the questions of diversity in the industry, the backlash against Marvel's presentation of characters like Thor with the female identity as personified by the character of Jane Foster. Mm-hmm. These questions are taking us interesting places, and as we watch the different series and the different characters and the responses from the audience unfold, it will be fascinating to see where this goes. It's part of a larger cultural dialogue. And I think one of the things that, to be a little bit more serious here than talking about Batawang, but, well, I just undercut myself with that one. But I think one of the things that makes following comics and other forms of popular culture so interesting, if I kind of step back from a scholarly perspective, is seeing the way that popular culture forms reflect and comment on what's happening in a larger way in society at that time. And all of these gender questions, the push and pull of creators and audiences and reviving characters, that can take us some really interesting places and prompt a lot of interesting discussion going forward.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Now, the other title that I wanted to mention is something quite different. Now, a couple of weekends ago, I went up to North Bethesda to Small Press Expo for this year. And I love Small Press Expo. I think after Heroes Con, it is my favorite. And it's a great way for me to introduce myself to a lot of creators, especially younger creators, that I may not be familiar with at all. I mean, it is a gold mine of self-published authors. And one person that I met there and actually got some copies of her mini-comic, Common Curses, Common Blessings, is Maritsa Patrinos. Yeah. And actually, Maritsa was nominated for an Ignatz this year in the category of Best Minicomic. Unfortunately, she didn't win. I can't remember what minicomic did win, but it definitely deserved a nomination. And I think it was issue number 4 is the one that captured the jury's attention for the nomination. And basically what you have with Common Curses, Common Blessings, and I brought my issues that I got from Maritsa the other weekend, It's a flip mini comic. Okay. So when you read in one direction, you see a variety of examples of what most people would think of as curses. So for instance, if I begin reading the common curses part of this flip mini comic, we have illustrations with text such as can't grow a beard, your fly is open, bad with names, long bathroom line, the dryer eats your socks, and so on and so forth. Until you get to the end of the issue, then you flip it and you get to the common blessings part. And those are illustrations and text that read, the cat sits on you, which is a blessing. Empty movie theater, definitely a blessing. Saw a celebrity. Your boss is on vacation. Didn't need braces. Green thumb. And on and on. And all 4 issues of Common Curses, Common Blessings are like that. And so the thing about Maritsa's art, I think it is relatively simple, straightforward. She uses a minimum of colors. For instance, in issue number 4, the primary colors are purple and green. In the first issue, it is kind of a dark bluish purple and darker orange or brick red. And it's the flip aspect of the mini comic that I particularly appreciate. So we get to see her art. We get to see her senses of what is and isn't something worth welcoming. Her sense of humor is also a part of it. And I really enjoyed this. Again, one of the reasons why I like to go to Small Press Expo is to become familiar with creators that I wasn't aware of before, especially those who self-publish. And I think that Maritsa Patrinos was a particularly great find this year for me.
Yeah, just looking at these comics on the table in front of us now as we're recording this podcast, they look like they're beautifully produced, very small in their size. I'm not quite sure how to describe the dimensions of them, but beautifully produced. I love the idea of blessings on one side and curses on another, and who knows? Maybe in some ways it's hard to tell the difference between blessings and curses sometimes.
Right.
I had a friend once tell me that things that look like they're really good events can sometimes be bad events, and things that look like bad events can sometimes be good events. And I think the format of this comic, the interesting production of it, looks like it is in the spirit of my friend Andy's wisdom to me.
And another thing about not only Common Curses, Common Blessings, but also, most mini comics is they're handmade.
Yeah,
and so
that's beautifully done.
Yes, and as such, for the most part, each individual issue of the same batch, right? So the first issue of, let's say, Common Curses, Common Blessings, is going to be unique in some way because it's made separately. Sometimes the uniqueness may come in terms of the cut or the way that it was stapled, or even the way that the author, in this case, inserts her or his own name and date in the text.
That's lovely. Yeah.
Yeah, and there is something about a homemade, crafted quality to mini comics that you don't get in the mass-produced mainstream. And I don't mean just like DC and Marvel in terms of the mainstream, but all major publishers, Dark Horse, Image, Valiant, things of that sort. So, and I really do appreciate those.
What would you say is the print run of these comics?
I don't know, and that's one of the things I didn't even think about asking Maritsa when I talked with her, because one of the things I like to do when I go to events like this, especially SPX, is to talk for a few minutes with creators at their table, if they have time, and then string those small interviews together into a longer episode. And I was able to talk with Maritsa for about, 8 or 9 minutes, and primarily about her work in mini comics, specifically with this title, Common Curses, Common Blessings. I didn't even think about asking about the print run, like how many they do put out.
Yeah. Again, beautiful looking publications. I'd like to be able to find copies of that.
Yeah. So it's definitely worth checking out. And off the top of my head, I can't remember Maritsa's website, but if you go to comicsalternative.com and do a search for SPX 2018, then you will see for the second on-location interview show, I do provide a hyperlink to Maritsa's website, so you can find out more about what she does. Yeah. So, yeah, that was a good find that I had at SPX this year. Now, have you ever been to a Small Press Expo?
I have not.
It's definitely worth going.
It sounds a lot of fun.
It is. And I can tell you that the crowd definitely skews quite a bit younger than, let's say, HeroesCon. Just because you do have a lot of people who self-publish, and the attendees are quite young as well. And it is a packed convention. So,
wow.
It's a lot of fun.
And I bet there are fewer people in costume.
I don't remember seeing anyone in costume. So no, and there are not that many cosplayers at Heroes, although there's some, but almost none at Small Press Expo. But definitely worth checking out. So Mike, what are you looking forward to in the weeks to come?
Well, title I picked up this evening is going back to a guy I'm very interested in, Tom King. He's got a new series for DC, Heroes in Crisis. That sounds interesting, to deal with the emotional consequences of being a superhero. Tom King's writing remains very interesting to me. I'm, of course, continuing to follow his work on Batman. We're about midway through what he says is a 100-issue story. My heart was broken when Catwoman jilted Batman. Sorry, spoilers, guys. Maybe this has something to do with Bat-a-wang? I don't know.
You got to bring that up again.
Once again, we're in the thickets of inappropriate material for this broadcast. So I'm interested in that. And that's all I've got right now.
I'm glad that you did bring up Tom King, because I wanted to tell you that one of the things I've done over the past week or two, I guess, is I finally finished Sheriff of Babylon.
Yeah.
I went through, because I got as I think I told you, the deluxe edition.
Right.
And twice I think I had read the first 2 or 3 issues and then put it off until I said, well, I'm going to get the deluxe. And I got the deluxe and I finally read it. So phenomenal. Just incredible.
Absolutely.
And I started to read, and I thought I would have finished it by tonight, but I didn't. His Vision.
Right, yeah.
And I've read, I think, the first third of or maybe the half of the Vision run. I like it. However, and again, I haven't finished it yet, so maybe my opinion will change. Yeah. I don't like it as much as Sheriff of Babylon, or as much as I think that I was expecting to like it, for this reason. Many times when a title comes out and people gush over it, it's the greatest thing, and it gets all the awards, I have a level of expectation, and maybe it's not the best thing, but I bring that to my reading. And so if I read it after all of the praise and the awards and everything take place, then it has a higher bar to meet. And again, I haven't finished it, so maybe I'll feel different when I get to the very end of that text. But it's okay.
Yeah, that was a series that took me completely by surprise. I was unaware of Tom King's reputation. I don't think he really had one before then. And the Vision is a longtime Marvel character. There is a very interesting story by the fiction writer Jonathan Lethem about the Vision. You can check that out in his book. I think it's called Men in Cartoons. So I had no idea what to expect with that series. And I found it very poignant. It's the Vision, the android superhero, settling down in the suburbs with a family of androids as well. I do think it builds in ways that are very interesting, and it's worth checking out. The Sheriff of Babylon, I think, is on another level altogether. And, of course, that reflects Tom King's own experience as, I believe, a CIA operative in Iraq after the invasion. It's hard for me to imagine reading that as a series published on a monthly or bi-monthly basis. I can't imagine not reading it as a whole book. But I think it's a terrific work in comics form and a terrific piece of political fiction as well.
Yeah, exactly. And one of the things that did strike me about Sheriff of Babylon, it is a very, if I can call it, literary story,
yeah.
Which is really impressive. Now, again, I don't want to short shrift the Vision King's the Vision. Again, I've read about half of it, so I've got the other half to read. It just strikes me as, I don't know, it's the expectations that I had going into it because of everybody praising it and winning the Eisner and all that.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, but I look forward to finishing that up.
Yeah.
One of the things I'm looking forward to, and I can see the very first issue exactly right across from me, is the first issue of the All Reds and Rich Tommaso's Dick Tracy.
Right, yeah.
I have a review copy of the first issue. I have a hard copy on order from Discount Comic Book Service. I haven't gotten it yet, but I haven't read the review copy yet. So I'm really looking forward to Dick Tracy. I think that's one Sturge and I may discuss on an upcoming weekly show, because I want to see what the All Reds and Tommaso do with this classic character.
Right, yeah. The only connection I can make to that is having picked up a relatively recent publication from Sunday Press.
Oh.
Great publishing line, occasional publishing line that does oversized volumes of vintage comic strips in their original size. Their last one was Chester Gould's Sunday Pages for Dick Tracy, and that's been a lot of fun to read and to look at. Again, if we're talking about the way popular culture forms exemplify their times, wow, that takes us right back into the 1930s. I'm not quite sure the era of Prohibition, but certainly the era of gangsters, and of course Chester Gould's artwork is among the masterly examples of the form itself.
Yeah, Sunday Press is one of those publishers that their texts I would tend to salivate over, but I don't get because they're expensive. It's kind of like the artist editions that we've discussed in the past.
Yeah.
And in fact, in the last previews catalog, the one for September, I remember seeing solicited another book of theirs that looks really enticing, and that is, what was the title of the strip that Popeye was in?
Thimble Theater.
Thimble Theater, yeah. Thimble Theater before Popeye.
Right, yeah.
And so it's the pre-Popeye Thimble Theater strips.
And that's by LZ Segar also?
Yes, yes. And so, that's going to be an upcoming Sunday Press publication. So that should look really good.
Right.
And in fact, speaking of really nice, oversized, and expensive editions, I was thinking about you the other day because... your penchant for getting occasionally the IDW artist editions.
Absolutely.
I only have two, as I've mentioned before, two artist editions from IDW, and both of them are Eisner's The Spirit.
Right, yeah.
But I thought of you in those artist editions because I recently, I think with my last shipment, or maybe the one before that, received A Contract with God Curators.
Oh, that's right. You've
collection.
mentioned that a couple of times.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, and we even discussed it on last week's episode of the review series. Phenomenal. It's in 2 volumes, and one is pencils, and then the other is inks. And especially the pencils volume, and it comes in a really nice slipcase.
Right.
The pencils volume includes material that Eisner had thought about including in the finished Contract with God, but decided not to.
Fascinating.
One example, I guess probably the best example of that is, I don't know if how long it's been since you've read Contract with God, but that third story, The Super.
Right, yeah, just last year,
yeah.
As a matter of fact.
And I think his original intent was to include a page where the Super kind of thinks back to his past life in Germany, and we see that he was, indeed, as we suspected, a German soldier. He was a Nazi.
Interesting.
And that explains a lot of his character. But again, his character in the finished Contract with God is described well enough to where it's almost a little heavy-handed to give us, a flashback, even just one page, of his Nazi past. So we can assume he was Nazi-esque at least.
Right, yeah.
And so Eisner eventually felt that, he didn't need that, and so he cut it. And I think that was a wise decision. Sure. But also just to see his, early draft of Contract with God in pencil and then in ink, it really is interesting. And there are some really nice, not really long, but I think insightful essays Dave Gibbons has one in, I think, the second volume, the Inks one, where he basically gives a brief historical overview of Eisner's career. And then, of course, I think in both volumes, Dennis Kitchen certainly has a couple of brief articles. And especially Kitchen's essay in the first volume, in the pencils, is insightful because he goes over some of the differences between the original conception of Contract with God and what we ultimately saw in the publication in 1977. Yeah. So, and Dennis Kitchen is someone who was really good friends with Will Eisner. Right, he was his publisher, among other things. And so he had a really close relationship with Eisner and can speak in a very informed manner. But yeah, that is, if you can get your hands on that, and that's going to be kind of pricey. The cheapest I've even found it is on Discount Comic Book Service, $117.
Wow. Yeah.
For that. And, that is a little more than some of the IDW artist editions.
Right. Yeah. These books are expensive. They are just in an era when sometimes we think about the book itself being an endangered species. To see the care and the beauty of these kind of publications, it's worth treasuring in and of itself. Assuming one plans out one's budget with some modicum of common sense.
Yeah. And that's why it's a rarity that I will get one of these types of texts that's so expensive.
Right.
But, I will go the extra mile for Eisner.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so as our listeners can tell on this episode of the On Location show, it's just been Mike and I talking. It kind of slow tonight. We haven't had any customers like the regulars come in and talk with us, but that's okay. And I think that's one of the reasons why we wanted to do this in terms of co-hosting, because we can talk with each other, even if no customers sit down and join us.
I'm sure Batawang scared them away.
Yeah. They thought, okay, if we come, we're gonna have to discuss this issue of Batman, and we don't want to talk about it.
There are some people out there who do still have a sense of shame. I am not among them, but there are some people like that,
as this episode has demonstrated. So again, we want to thank the good people at Heroes Aren't Hard to Find. Again, they're located at 417 Pecan Avenue in Charlotte, North Carolina. Definitely check them out. Well worth it. That's Heroes Aren't Hard to Find. And if you want to get in touch with me or Mike and Mike and let us know what you thought about this On Location episode, then hey, go to our website, comicsalternative.com, and you'll find that you can leave us a voice message online via SpeakPipe. Or you can call us the old-fashioned way. Pick up your phone and dial 4153-COMICS. That's 415-326-6427. You can also email us. We're two guys at comicsalternative.com, or you can email me directly at Derek@comicsalternative.com. And Mike?
Michael at comicsalternative.com.
That's right. You can also find us all over social media. We have accounts on Twitter, Facebook, Tumblr, Instagram, Google+, Goodreads, Pinterest, YouTube, Slack, and Discord. You can subscribe to the podcast through Apple Podcasts. You can stream us on Stitcher. You can also find us on Google Podcasts, on Spotify, on iHeartRadio, and on TuneIn. But you can find every single one of our podcast episodes, as well as the reviews and comics-related commentary that we post on our blog, simply by going to our website, comicsalternative.com. And, of course, now you can find us as a member of the Queen City Podcast Network. So you can find us all over the place.
That's right. So once was lost, but now I'm found.
That's right. And we will find ourselves back at Heroes Aren't Hard to Find in another 2 or 3 weeks for our October shows. Until then, I'm Derek.
And I'm Mike.
Take care.